Usually when you think about 17th century Baroque art, there's this expectation of polite beauty.
Right, yeah, like very composed.
Exactly. You picture these very staged, glowing figures looking upward. It's the kind of art you just respectfully nod at while you're walking through a quiet museum.
It's grand, it's composed, and, above all, it's highly idealized. Nobody is sweating.
No.
Nobody looks truly terrified.
But then you walk into a different gallery, and you are confronted with a painting that completely shatters that quiet museum vibe.
Oh, totally shatters it.
The muscles of the figures are visibly straining, their faces are twisted in this genuine ugly effort, and blood is literally skirting across the canvas in this hyper-realistic, horrifying way. You realize instantly that this isn't polite at all, this is raw.
Yeah, it forces you to stop dead in your tracks. I mean,
Yeah.
it completely disrupts all those tidy expectations you have of the era.
And the person holding that paintbrush was Artemisia Gentileschi. So today, we are taking the sources that document her incredible life to understand how a 17th century woman survived absolute horror to become the CEO of her own artistic empire.
It's quite the journey.
It really is. Our mission for this deep dive is to separate the modern myth of Artemisia as just, a traumatized survivor from the reality of who she actually was, which is a savvy, groundbreaking, and frankly genius artist who manipulated the systems of her time.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even begin with her story?
Well, to understand the mechanics of how she built that empire, we first have to look at the machinery of her early life. She was born in Rome in 1593, and her entire childhood was defined by her father's art studio.
Because her mother died when she was young, right?
Exactly. Her mother died when Artemisia was around 12, so she was practically raised by her father, Orazio Gentileschi, inside his workshop.
See, I always hear the word workshop, and I picture like a quaint little garage setup with a few easels. But what did a 17th century art studio actually look and function like? Oh, it was essentially a small manufacturing hub. And it was really hard physical labor. We are talking about grinding raw lapis lazuli into pigment, boiling oils, stretching these heavy canvases, and dealing with incredibly toxic materials.
Wow. So she's really in the trenches.
Completely. Artemisia was right in the middle of this grime and creation. And Orazio, her father, was a very prominent painter who was deeply plugged into the most radical art movement of the time, which was driven by a painter named Caravaggio.
Right. Caravaggio. We hear his name thrown around a lot when talking about this era. What was he doing that was so radical that Orazio and eventually Artemisia were just so obsessed with it?
Well, Caravaggio completely changed the visual language of art by using a technique called tenebrism.
Tenebrism. Okay.
Yeah. And if you want to visualize tenebrism, imagine painting a scene inside a pitch-black room. And the only illumination is a single, harsh, bright spotlight pointed directly at your subject's face.
Oh, so it creates this massive theatrical contrast between the light and the dark.
Precisely. It's very dramatic. And combined with that lighting, Caravaggio used ordinary people as models, people off the street with dirty feet and wrinkled faces.
Not the idealized figures we usually see.
Exactly. Now, Orazio adopted a version of this, but he still liked to clean things up a bit. He preferred his figures to look a little more polished. So Artemisia learned in his workshop alongside her brothers, but she quickly outpaced everyone. By the time she was 19, Orazio was openly bragging that she was peerless.
And the proof is really in her earliest surviving work, right? Susanna and the Elders, which she painted when she was just 17. And this is what I don't get. If she learned everything from her father, why doesn't this painting look like her father's work?
What's fascinating here is that even at 17, she was making deliberate, independent choices. She took that heavy spotlight effect of the Caravaggisti style, but she completely rejected her father's habit of making women look flawlessly, artificially beautiful.
She wanted them to look real.
Yeah. When you look at her figure of Susanna, the woman has actual physical weight. She has realistic flesh. Artemisia refused to idealize the human form, giving her subjects a powerful, grounded gravity that was entirely her own invention.
It makes me think of a musician taking a classic, heavily studio-produced pop song and stripping it all the way down to a raw acoustic cover.
Yeah.
Suddenly you aren't just hearing the melody, you're feeling the actual emotion behind the lyrics.
That's a great way to put it.
But right as she is establishing this unique voice in Rome, the entire trajectory of her life is violently derailed.
Right. The turning point comes in 1611. And to understand what happens, you have to look at the social dynamics of Rome at the time. Artemisia is a young woman without a mother, meaning she is highly vulnerable in a society with strict social codes.
So she needs a chaperone.
Exactly. So Orazio recruited a female tenant who lived upstairs, a woman named Donna Tuzia, to act as her chaperone.
And her one job was to protect Artemisia.
That was the expectation. But Orazio was working on a project with a fellow painter named Agostino Tassi. Tassi started coming around the house, and Tuzia allowed him, along with a minor papal official who actually had a history of harassing Artemisia, to visit on multiple occasions.
Oh, wow. So the chaperone is basically failing completely.
Yes. Tuzia essentially turned a blind eye as Tassi became increasingly obsessed with the teenager. And then, one day in May, Tassi found Artemisia alone, and he raped her.
And the sources document that Artemisia fought back fiercely. She scratched his face, she grabbed a knife to defend herself, and she screamed for Tuzia to come help her. But Tuzia ignored her.
It's horrific.
If you put yourself in Artemisia's shoes, the psychological devastation of that betrayal is just staggering. Your only protector is actively complicit in your assault.
The betrayal is profound, and the immediate aftermath is dictated by the warped logic of the era. Tassi demanded they continue to have sexual relations, and he did this by promising he would marry her.
Which, I mean, feels completely counterintuitive today. But at the time, marriage to your attacker was viewed as the standard social mechanism to restore a woman's virtue and protect her reputation.
That was the social contract back then. Artemisia agreed because she believed this was her only viable path forward to avoid total ruin. But here is the devastating catch. Tassi was secretly already married.
He was married.
Yes, he was estranged from his wife, but legally he couldn't marry Artemisia anyway.
So 9 months go by, the marriage never happens, and her father, Orazio, finally presses charges. But if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, the father is stepping up to demand justice for his traumatized daughter, you have to throw your modern understanding of justice right out the window.
Right, because it wasn't about her trauma at all.
Exactly. Orazio didn't press charges for her trauma. He pressed charges because Tassi had damaged his property.
That is the harsh reality of the 17th century legal system. The law gauged damage to economic and social assets. Orazio's property, his daughter's virginity, had been damaged.
Which threatened her marriageability.
Yes, which then threatened the family's financial standing and honor.
The trial lasts 7 months. And during this time, the court uncovers that Tassi is a serial criminal. He'd planned to murder his wife, he had an incestuous affair with his sister-in-law, and he was even conspiring to steal Orazio's paintings.
The man is a walking parade of red flags.
Right. So naturally, the court decides they need to verify the testimonies. But here's where it gets really interesting. Like, wait, who do they torture to make sure the truth is being told?
They tortured the victim. They tortured Artemisia.
That is just sickening to wrap your head around. I mean, how did they even do it?
They used a judicial torture device called the Sibylle. It is essentially a brutal form of a thumbscrew. They wrapped coarse cords around Artemisia's fingers and used a mechanism to pull those cords agonizingly tight, crushing the bones and tissues.
Her fingers, the very instruments she needs to paint, to survive, to have any kind of future, they are literally crushing her livelihood.
It's incredibly cruel. And while this is happening, while she's enduring unimaginable pain in the middle of the courtroom, she looks directly at Tassi and delivers a line that has echoed through history.
Oh, I know this quote.
She says, "This is the ring that you give me, and these are your promises."
It gives me chills every time I hear it. It's a statement of absolute defiance.
It is. Tassi was ultimately convicted and sentenced to exile from Rome. But if we look at the mechanics of justice back then, the punishment was a joke.
How so?
Well, the exile was never truly enforced, and he barely spent a year in prison. The system simply was not built to protect women.
Because the Roman legal system treated her as damaged property rather than a human being, Artemisia clearly realized she couldn't rely on traditional social safety nets. She had to build her own power.
Absolutely.
And that necessity is exactly what drives the next chapter. A month after the trial, she marries a modest artist named Pier Antonio Stiatesi, and they pack up and move to Florence. Now, you might expect her to just hide away in a new city and live quietly, but she does the exact opposite.
Yeah, Florence is where she transforms from a survivor into a mogul. She becomes the very first woman accepted into the Accademia delle Arti del Disegno, the Academy of the Arts of Drawing.
But how does a disgraced, functionally illiterate woman arriving from Rome manage to shatter a massive glass ceiling like that?
By mastering the mechanics of courtly culture. She didn't just paint, she learned to read and write. She immersed herself in the theatrical and musical performances of Florence.
She leveled up, basically.
Exactly. She realized that to get the backing of the incredibly powerful Medici family, who were basically the ultimate venture capitalists of the Renaissance, she couldn't just be a good painter. She had to be a charismatic intellectual.
And her networking is on another level. She literally strikes up a friendship with Galileo.
Yeah,
We
Galileo.
have a letter she wrote to him in 1635. And her connection with him was so strong that it actually influenced her art. When she painted the Allegory of Inclination, she painted a nude woman widely believed to be a self-portrait holding a compass, which was a direct nod to Galileo's scientific instruments.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the context of that commission is fascinating. Michelangelo's great nephew was building a lavish house to celebrate his famous relative, and he hired the best artists to paint the ceiling. Artemisia was part of that elite group.
Not only was she part of it, she was pregnant at the time, and she demanded and received 3 times more money than any of her male peers working on the exact same ceiling.
Incredible confidence.
Right. When we think about artists, we often romanticize them as these tragic figures waiting to be discovered. But Artemisia was incredibly shrewd. It's like she was a savvy, modern tech founder.
She understood her brand perfectly. She knew that the Medici court loved lavish theatrical spectacles. So she started dressing her biblical and mythological figures in contemporary, incredibly expensive-looking silk gowns and jewelry.
So she was playing to her crowd.
Yes, she was painting for her audience, turning her canvases into high-end luxury goods.
Now, her personal life in Florence was also incredibly complex. In 2011, historians discovered a collection of letters revealing that she had a passionate, long-term affair with a wealthy nobleman named Francesco Maria Maringhi.
That was a huge discovery.
And what blows my mind is that her husband, Pier Antonio, knew all about it. He even wrote his own letters to Maringhi on the back of Artemisia's love letters.
Well, you have to look at the economic reality of their household. Maringhi was bankrolling them.
Oh, so it was financial.
Yeah, he was a powerful aristocratic ally providing essential financial support. Pier Antonio tolerated the affair because Maringhi's money and influence kept their massive debts at bay.
But eventually, those mounting debts and the swirling rumors about the affair catch up with them. Around 1620, she is essentially forced out of Florence, and this launches her era as an international CEO. She moves back to Rome, she goes up to Venice, and eventually she settles in Naples. And in every single city, she acts like a sponge.
She was a master of adaptation. In Rome, she exchanged ideas with French artists like Simone Vouet. When she traveled to Venice, she absorbed the techniques of Venetian colorism.
For those of us who aren't art historians, what does Venetian colorism actually look like compared to that pitch-black spotlight effect she used in Rome?
So instead of relying on stark, dramatic shadows to build a form, colorism builds the painting through layers of vibrant, glowing pigments.
Okay, so it's more about the hue than the shadow.
Exactly. The focus shifts to the richness of the fabrics, the warmth of the skin tones, and a more luminous atmosphere. By integrating this, she proved she wasn't just a one-trick pony. She was evolving her technique to meet the specific tastes of regional buyers.
And when she gets to Naples around 1630, she scales up massively. Naples is a booming city with a huge appetite for art. She starts taking on massive commissions, including these huge cathedral paintings.
I really want to push back on the idea of Artemisia painting alone in a dark room. In Naples, she was essentially operating like a modern blockbuster film director, wasn't she? That is the perfect way to describe it. In Naples, she ran a highly collaborative enterprise. She had a team of assistants, including an artist named Onofrio Palumbo, who essentially acted as her foreman.
Like an assistant director.
Yes. And as the director, Artemisia would paint the crucial close-ups, the emotional, twisting faces, and the dramatic gestures that defined her brand. Then she would delegate the background architecture and the sprawling landscapes to her crew.
So she is managing a staff, meeting high market demand, and shipping product. She even influenced the techniques of the famous male painters she collaborated with, like Massimo Stanzione.
Her professional stature was monumental. She wasn't a local curiosity, she was a global phenomenon. She was selling paintings to the Duke of Alcala.
Wow.
And in 1638, she even traveled to London to work at the court of King Charles I, who specifically invited her to join her father there. The King of England was a massive art collector, and he proudly owned her self-portrait as the allegory of painting.
She eventually returns to Naples and continues to dominate the market until her death around 1654. But because she lived such a violent, dramatic life, and because her art has such a specific focus, Modern historians and critics have been locked in this fierce debate over exactly how we should interpret her legacy.
The statistics of her surviving body of work are really striking when you look at them. Over 90% of her paintings feature women as the primary protagonists.
And these aren't passive, delicate figures,
Not at all. They're rebellious, courageous, and frequently violent.
the ultimate example being her painting Judith slaying Holofernes.
Yes. The Italian art critic Roberto Longhi wrote a famous piece about that specific painting in 1916. What fascinated him wasn't just the violence, but what he called the impassibility of the painter.
Impassibility, like coldness.
Sort of.
Hmm.
He marveled at how realistically the blood spurts from the neck, but also noted a cold, calculated realism. It's like her heroine's primary concern in the middle of a beheading is just trying not to get blood on her expensive silk dress.
Fast forward to the 1970s, and feminist scholars like Linda Nochlin and Mary Gerard look at that exact same painting and see something completely different. They framed Artemisia as a feminist icon, a trauma survivor who was manifesting her revenge against patriarchal oppression right there on the canvas.
It's an incredibly compelling lens, especially given the horrors of the trial. But other art historians push back strongly against flattening her narrative like that.
How so?
Well, Griselda Pollock argues that the Judith painting isn't about rape revenge at all. She sees it as a masterclass in depicting political courage, two women collaborating to commit a daring assassination in a war zone.
And art historian Judith W. Mann warns that reading everything she did strictly through a feminist lens creates dangerous, narrow expectations. If we only look for the angry, assertive woman seeking revenge, we might undervalue her quiet religious portraits or her incredible business versatility.
Some historians take it a step further, suggesting that Artemisia was purely capitalizing on the public notoriety of her trial. Yeah, they argue she knew there was a niche market of wealthy male patrons who wanted sexually charged, violently dramatic art, and she brilliantly supplied exactly what they wanted to buy.
Pop culture has really stumbled over this debate, too. There was a film in 1997 simply called Artemisia, and the director made the baffling choice to depict her assault by Tassi as a consensual, loving relationship.
Which is just wild.
It is. Given the actual trial transcripts and the torture she endured, it's just a wild, insulting rewriting of history.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean? How do we balance this? Are we actually insulting her genius if we assume every single painting she made was just a diary entry about her drama?
This raises an important question. That is the core tension of her legacy. We have a habit of projecting our modern need for a neat, singular narrative onto historical figures.
I want to put them in a box.
Exactly. The feminist perspective is vital because it highlights her incredible defiance of 17th century gender norms. But if we reduce her to only her trauma, we erase her agency. She was a master of regional styles, a shrewd capitalist, a manager of men, and a technical genius. She wasn't just painting her pain, she was painting for power.
She contained multitudes.
Ah.
And that brings us to the end of our journey today. We've tracked Artemisia's path from a teenage prodigy grinding pigments in her father's grimy studio through the literal torture of a public trial to her rise as a brilliant CEO running workshops in Florence, London, and Naples.
She navigated a legal and social framework that was designed to crush her, and she dismantled it from the inside out.
And if you're listening to this, I think her life offers such a profound resonance. It's so incredibly easy to let one terrible event or one unfair label that society slaps on you define the boundaries of your entire life.
Very true.
But Artemisia's story is a masterclass in refusing to be a footnote in someone else's story. When the world tried to categorize her as damaged property, she grabbed the paintbrush and insisted on rendering her own reality on her own terms.
She forced the world to look at women and to look at her exactly the way she demanded to be seen.
Which leaves us with one final, provocative thought to mull over. If the tragedy of the trial had never happened, if she hadn't been forced into that horrible, agonizing public spotlight, would history have still recognized her undeniable genius? Or did the scandal ironically force the male-dominated art world to pay attention just long enough to realize that she was, in fact, the greatest painter among them all? Something to think about next time you look closely at a painting. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.